Good morning, everybody. Welcome to CDE this morning, CDE Virtual. Today, we're launching a new report. It's based on discussions with Professor David Kaplan and Professor Laurence Edwards from UCT, two of the leading economics professors in the country. CDE is grateful to the two professors for their contribution to the report and for working with us. However, we should stress that any errors or omissions are CDE's alone. The two professors are joining us this morning to help launch this report, and they will be saying a few words after I have spoken, and then all three of us will be happy to take questions, first from the media and then from everybody else. So our program today is I'm going to talk for about 25 minutes, a presentation, which I'll start sharing now, and then we'll move to questions. So let me start with the headlines for our report. Localization is an appealing idea, but unfortunately there is no free lunch. It will involve high costs to our economy and our society. It contradicts other important policies the president has set as priorities for the country. In our view, business should not be supporting this policy, and the country needs a development strategy that builds our capacity for exporting. By raising costs, reducing competitiveness and domestic competition, localization is in fact an anti-export strategy. Now, the idea of localization has become popular. It's widely identified as a policy priority. There was support for it in all the documents that emerged last year from government, business, labor, NEDLAC, in terms of our recovery and growth strategy. There is now an agreement at NEDLAC to pursue localization of 20% of all non-petroleum imports in 5 years. And in the master plans that for each sector of the economy that are being developed, these also include proposals that are indistinguishable from localization policy. As we saw a year ago, localization is a key pillar in the president's economic recovery strategy. Now, the idea seems obvious and attractive. The argument is that localization will increase GDP because GDP, after all, is about consumption, investment, and exports. And if you take away imports, we will boost GDP. We'll also expand employment, they say, and increase industrial capacity. Now, this is an attractive idea for many interest groups because they compete with imports. The CDE report will argue that all these claims can be disputed. The benefits of localization are overstated, and the costs are dramatically underestimated. We will argue that the case that has been made for localization is not convincing. In our view, it is economically short-sighted. It ignores the large but diffuse costs that must be paid by society, even as it creates small but highly concentrated benefits for some firms, whose output will expand through effective localization policies. So what is localization? It refers to two different but related policies. Firstly, compulsory localization targets in government procurement of designated products. Secondly, what you might call import substitution industrialization in which all economic actors switch demand from imports to local products. Now, there's a key difference between these two policies. The government can only enforce localization requirements on state institutions. Government cannot enforce localization on the private sector without violating global agreements. So we have two approaches then: compulsory procurement in the state, a narrow approach, and then a much larger industrialization through localization approach, which is much broader. Let's start with the first one. The Preferential Procurement Framework Act allows the DTIC to designate products that must be procured by organs of state wholly or substantially from local sources. The current list includes 27 products, but the plan is to increase this to 42, and each with a private sector champion. And as you've seen recently, cement has just been added to this list. Now, you might be asking yourself, what's so bad about localization anyway? For many, it seems as though localization is cost-free, but there are direct costs. According to Professor Kaplan, when products are designated for local procurement, it means those products were not the first choice. They must be more costly or of an inferior quality. According to Professor Edwards, there are a limited number of local sources. So those sources, those firms, can then charge more. And in fact, there's no upper boundary on the price that local firms can set. Jagdish Bhagwati from Columbia University says that this kind of approach encourages directly unproductive activity. You encourage firms to put energy and resources into lobbying government to have products designated, rather than increasing output or efficiency. Now, the DTIC likes to argue that providing protection to local firms is necessary for them to build local competencies or economies of scale to become competitive. We think the opposite is often the case. Localization can reduce incentives to be efficient or innovative. In Professor Edwards' view, you end up supporting very inefficient firms. This is especially true in South Africa, where industries tend to be highly concentrated. In an economy with limited competition between local firms to supply products that government agencies are allowed to purchase elsewhere. But there are also indirect costs of localization. The requirement that government purchase some items solely from local firms imposes costs on government and the rest of society. Think of infrastructure. Think of a public agency that has to procure goods from the domestic market, and they're more expensive. They will then spread these costs and impose them on every user of the service, of trains, of ports. The cost of using local products is the difference between its price and the price of the lowest cost import. But there's another cost. Relying on expensive or inferior intermediate and capital goods can have knock-on effects, requiring the redesign of plant or equipment or the manufacturing process. So think of pumps, for example. They come in a vast range of performance specifications and designs. The South African ones may not be the most appropriate to the project that is being undertaken. So if you have to buy South African products, you may have to change the design of the whole project. Take another example. We are told that Transnet locomotives are standing idle because they must source parts locally, but cannot. Mining companies are so anxious to get the trains moving that some of them have offered to buy these imported parts themselves. So what happens is that everything becomes hostage to what South African manufacturers can actually provide. Take Transnet. Transnet is obliged by DTIC Fiat to buy train tracks from local manufacturers. There are, in fact, no local manufacturers. As a result, Transnet had to request Treasury approval for deviating from localization policies. In the words of Portia Darby, the CEO, you cannot imagine the time it takes to argue about this issue. So in addition to all else, localization will slow down development, just what South Africa needs. Think about our infrastructure, especially power and logistics, and the poor quality that we have and we're trying to fix are an enormous brake on economic growth, and they impose huge costs on industry. In our view, it's a disaster to hold up infrastructure delivery. Let's look at the second kind of localization. Now here the policy goal is that 20% of non-oil imports will be replaced by local products in 5 years. And this target appears to have been agreed at NEDLAC by business, government, and labor. Business seems to have given cautious approval, but they seem to be committed to this policy. I want to remind you that this approach cannot be enforced by government without violating international agreements. And this is something that business might want to keep in mind. Let's look at this let's look at this graph produced by Intellidex. Now the green part indicates the sales growth required in the next 5 years to achieve this 20% goal. Now the sectors on the right of the graph have been shrinking in the last 5 years, but would have to grow at 20 to 50% per year over the next 5 years if they were to replace 20% of imports in those sectors. Of course, this assumes that the growth of these sectors does not require imports. If it does, they would have to grow even faster to offset the increase in imports. So what are the problems with industrialization through localization? Replacing imports through increased productivity or competitiveness of local industry is obviously desirable. But to the extent that this is achieved through protectionism, the results are likely to be costs to consumers and the users of imported intermediate and capital goods. A key problem here is conceptual. The DTIC claims that South Africa has an overpropensity to import. But this is, in our view, factually not true. It also completely misunderstands the role of imports in industrialization. Now, before I address the costs and veracity of the DTIC's claim about our propensity to import, we need to examine a prior question. Does protection ever work? This is the infant industry argument. The argument is that protection preserves jobs, but also makes later expansion possible. Think of Sasol and Iscor or ArcelorMittal. These are the two most cited examples. And it's true that the foundation of South Africa's industrialization and of the chemicals industry was created through these companies and the capabilities they have developed that wouldn't have existed without them. But there's a big but. Both Sasol and ArcelorMittal have faced allegations of anti-competitive behavior. They operate behind tariff barriers, and decades after their founding, they still sell their goods to local customers at import parity prices. What does that mean? Well, all the investment and protection enjoyed by these two companies, Iscor and Sasol, have not resulted in lower prices to South African users. They have not made anyone else more competitive. What about automobiles or automotives, often seen as the big success story for protectionist policies? But are they? There's been no recent independent assessment of the costs and benefits to the economy. The only look at this was in 2008 when the Harvard Asgisa team, working with government, argued that the costs were greater than the benefits. Now, the benefits of our automotive industry are jobs, know-how, and trade surplus. The costs are higher vehicle prices for local consumers and businesses, the ban on the import of second-hand cars, and higher transport costs overall. The result is fewer cars on the roads and overall fewer jobs in selling and maintaining vehicles. Now, the best case scenario for protectionist policies is that some firms that benefit from localization policy will become more efficient and competitive. But this will not be the aggregate or average effect and will generally only apply to specific firms. Let's look at clothing. In the clothing industry, government support has definitely helped some firms become more productive and to claim a greater share of the domestic market. But those firms operate behind very high tariff protection. So it's not true that they are becoming more competitive generally. In fact, South African production has been shrinking all the time. And critically, even when supported firms have done well, it is often at the expense of other domestic firms' market share. So it is not even obvious that there is a net benefit for South Africa as a whole. There are, of course, firms that benefit from localization policies when they have guaranteed offtake agreements and when they are already pretty sophisticated and functional. But this tends to strengthen the larger firms and reduces competition in local industry. Let's turn now to the DTIC's claim about the overpropensity of the country to import. The DTIC says the problem is South Africa imports unusually high proportion of goods and that this justifies localization. We don't think this is true. According to DTIC, South Africa's non-petroleum imports are about 25% of GDP. But that's not at all unusual if you look at other countries. It's important to understand that there's a strong link between how much a country imports and how much it exports. There's not a strong link between how rich or poor a country is and how much it imports. The implication here is important. There's no reason to think that you can get richer by reducing imports. There are, on the other hand, good reasons to think that if you reduce imports, you will also reduce exports. In fact, South Africa's imports and exports as a ratio of GDP are similar to a very large number of countries. If you look at this graph, you will see that South Africa is essentially the same as Germany, South Korea, Sweden, and it's lower than Portugal, Mexico, Malaysia, and Thailand. The fact is that imports are critical for development. There's a strong link between imports and exports. Manufactured exports require capital goods South Africa doesn't make. The government agrees that there is no point trying to reduce oil imports because South Africa cannot produce oil. But we would argue that there's also no reason to think that South Africa can produce smartphones. Integrated global supply chains means there's a tight link between imports and exports. This is in fact proven by the motor vehicle master plan's export success. And all of South Africa's automotive exports are heavily import dependent. By targeting imports, South Africa's ability to export is directly threatened. It's hard to see how a deliberate strategy of reducing imports is appropriate for South Africa. In fact, successful exporters are more likely to be significant importers of intermediary goods and component parts than are firms that don't export. Localization is an anti-export strategy. Most successful developing countries in the past half century have focused on expanding exports as rapidly as possible. By reducing choices and competition and raising costs, localization makes it harder to be competitive in global markets. By reducing the supply of imports, South African exporters are cut off from the supply chains needed to export. This is the wrong priority for South Africa. The localization strategy undermines South Africa's economic approach. The president is committed to reducing the costs of doing business. He wants South Africa to be a competitive investment environment for domestic and international investors. He wants to open our economy to new firms. He sees infrastructure as a key pillar of recovery and our growth strategy. And the SARB is charged with moderating inflation. But the truth is, localization is in direct contradiction to all of these. Professor Dave Kaplan would argue, essentially, this is a cost-raising strategy. It's going to raise costs, and in doing so, it is going to make the whole economy less efficient. It also is a tax on exporters. The rise in costs and lower efficiency of infrastructure harms exporters most because they have far less capacity to pass their higher costs onto customers. In effect, localization is anti-export. South Africa's export performance is really weak, despite recent surpluses. We are losing ground, and one of the main reasons for this is that the logistics infrastructure in the country, electricity, rail, and ports, can't handle more load. Localization will only make it harder to get this right. And this is another way in which this policy is anti-exports. The truth is, South Africa's poor economic performance over the past 13 years has nothing to do with any supposed overpropensity to import. It has everything to do with a range of self-inflicted policy and governance injuries. We all know what these are: our inability to keep the lights on, our decaying infrastructure. Container terminals at our ports are both very expensive and very inefficient. The deepening fiscal crisis, rising levels of lawlessness, and an education system that has been unable to produce adequate numbers of skilled workers. What we need is a much more dynamic and competitive economy. But localization will raise costs. It will protect incumbent firms, reducing domestic competition. It will reduce incentives to innovate. It will add additional regulatory burdens. It will encourage lobbying to become designated firms or products. It will delay infrastructure delivery, and it will undermine our export capacity. It will divert attention from priorities, fixing our power, rail, road, and other logistics issues, building capabilities for exporting, making it easier to do business. The argument for localization is not persuasive. This is a misguided strategy that will further constrain future development. Now, you have to ask yourself why organized business is going along with this strategy. In the desperate context of South Africa's economic stagnation, any policies that seek to strengthen local industry are likely to appeal to a range of stakeholders. Nevertheless, the claims made on localization's behalf are simply not credible. It's important to recognize that the DTIC has sought to justify the localization policy by a focus on the occasional success story. And its approach will be loudly supported by the firms that benefit. The broader costs of the policy, to be borne by government, by South African consumers, by non-designated firms, non-insider firms, and by exporters, will be ignored. Localization benefits some companies more than others. It benefits companies that already dominate their niches in our economy. In our view, organized business should not be seen to be supporting a policy that reduces competition by strengthening incumbent firms at the expense of new entrants. Let me conclude then. South Africa is not an over-importer. There are serious and significant costs involved in enforcing localization. It's easy to identify success when touting localization, but the costs are much greater and they diffuse throughout the economy. Few countries have developed except through export-led growth. Seeking to replace imports is no substitute for building capabilities for exporting. What South Africa really needs, and urgently, is an export strategy. But by raising costs, reducing competitiveness and domestic competition, localization is in fact an anti-export strategy? I'm now going to ask David Kaplan and Laurence Edwards to add a few words. After that, we will take questions. And first, we will respond to questions from the media. If the media can please put your hands up, and then you will be unmuted to speak. We will then take questions from everyone else. Please put these in the chat section, and I see there are already a large number of these, and I will select from those questions. Dave Kaplan, over to you.
Well, thank you, Anne, and thank you, everybody, for being here. And just a few remarks. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of questions and we're going to answer, so I'll be very brief. But I think what Anne has clearly outlined is the anti-export strategy that localization is. And I want to just add one dimension to that. I mean, Anne spoke very eloquently about the raising of costs, about the infrastructure inefficiencies that you have to adjust to local products. All of these aspects are very important. They raise costs and they reduce efficiency throughout the economy. But I want you also to think at a micro level. Think about the firm that now receives a guaranteed government order. Its product has been declared locally made and state enterprises must purchase that product. What's the position? The position of that firm now is that it has a guaranteed market. It has a guaranteed market which is going to be profitable. And what's it going to do? It's going to say, okay, I've got a guaranteed market domestically. I'm doing well here. Let me devote all my resources, my energies to maintaining that profitable market. Why should I go for exports? Exports are difficult. I'm making well on the domestic market. There's no incentive to go for exports. I'm behind the technology frontier, if you like. I'm not an efficient producer. I'm doing well on the export market. End of story. I may even use those surpluses to keep any competitors that might be coming up out of my market. I lobby to keep what I have in place. So that's what economists talk about as an anti-export bias. This is an anti-export bias that operates at the firm level. It makes firms that are comfortable earning good profits in the domestic market, stay in the domestic market, protect their domestic market, and takes them away from what we really want, which is South African firms operating in a small domestic economy to expand into exports where real scale and therefore output and employment gains are really possible. So I just want to, I'm sure there's lots of room for more discussion, but I want to add that anti-export bias in the localization strategy to what Anne has said. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Dave. Laurence Edwards, over to you.
Thanks, Anne. So thank you everyone for participating. I think this is going to turn out to be a very interesting and provocative discussion, which I think is very good because this is an important policy that's being debated. It has potentially substantive impacts on the domestic economy and on the direction that the government takes in trying to deal with industrialization and development and growth. And I think my key concern really is, to some extent, that the emphasis on localization as a key strategy for industrialization detracts from the main imperative, I think, is that of driving exports. When we look at advanced economy, we look at countries growing, they grow primarily through, all countries that grow, middle economy countries that grow, or low income, that become income economies, they grow through expanding exports. Exports is a critical component of the growth process. And the focus on localization is a detraction from that key essential focus. And it's not clear and it's not obvious that the focus on localization as a central policy instrument for industrialization is going to generate the industrial base that will drive export growth. And so therefore, this is a key concern that I have in relation to the general localization debate, which is, I think, very complex, and there are nuances around this, so it's hard to capture it all in a single term. But just that's the broad thread of the point I'd like to make. The second is, I really would like to emphasize the imperative of the export problem, or the imperative of resolving our export problem that we face. If we look at our economy now, or at least in 2019, what we see is our exports to GDP are lower than they were pre-crisis, pre-global financial crisis. So what we have seen is a very slow growth in exports. We haven't seen a diversification of the economy towards the export-oriented market. When we look, in fact, if we look over our performance more detailed, if we look at the number of firms that are participating, we see a number of very concerning trends. The number of exporters are declining since 2014, 2015. We're seeing a retreat from exporting amongst many firms. We're actually moving the wrong direction from where we'd want to do. And this is problematic, I think, from many fronts. One is our domestic economy is simply too small to generate the large-scale employment that we need to deal with unemployment problem. We need the international market. The international market is a large source of demand, and we're not exploiting that major source of demand to generate firm output, production, and employment. And that's an imperative I think we need to focus on. The second is, if we think about growth dynamics, we see that imports are have a very high GDP elasticity. In other words, when the economy grows by 1%, our import volumes grow by 1.5%, 1.8%. I don't know the full elasticity at this point, but it's a very elastic response. And the reason why is intermediate inputs are key components of the growth process. When firms grow, they expand, they need production inputs, they need capital goods. Many of these goods are sourced from international sources. And so the implication really is that when we grow fast, if we want to grow fast, we're going to experience very strong growth in import volumes and import values. And we have a long history of foreign exchange constraints, balance of payments constraints. And the way we need to generate the foreign exchange. We can generate the foreign exchange through foreign savings. But that's not necessarily a long-term sustainable position. We need to generate the foreign exchange through exports. So our growth strategy implies import growth, which then requires a proper export growth strategy to generate the foreign exchange. And so not focusing on these two dimensions really misses the key ingredients, I think, of the growth dimension within South Africa. And it's not clear that the localization policy itself tackles that problem. And we see this in many dimensions. I mean, one is, the master plans are potentially quite effective mechanisms to assist coordination across members of the value chains. These are very important and potentially powerful mechanisms to organize coordination across the full value chain, improve efficiencies along that value chain. But they're focused on industries, whereas the constraints that firms face in terms of exporting are not industry specific. We look at the constraints they face, it's access to electricity, it's access in some cases to skills, it's burdens at the port. These are cross-cutting constraints that are not industry-specific. And it's not clear that the localization policies embedded within the master plans are necessarily going to resolve those cross-cutting concerns that are the primary constraints to growth, I think, with many firms, but also exports as well. So again, the way we're thinking about domestic policy and the way we orientate our focus on where the emphasis policy should be, I think is detracting from a key consideration, namely that of boosting exports and figuring out what the constraints are to all firms that wish to export. I think these are the two kind of key points, or 3 points, that I wanted to just emphasize in relation to this debate. Thanks.
Thanks, Laurence. Great. Okay. Are there any media who would like to ask a question? If you'd put up your hand and I'll turn to you. Okay. None that I can see. There are a lot of questions. I'm going to try and manage this as best I can. Let's start with, I think the one question is that we're being much too simplistic in how we're presenting this, that it appears to be a choice between localization and export. I think Laurence was trying to amplify some of those remarks, and obviously we're more detailed in our report. But Dave, would you like to talk about the charge of being too simplistic here, and that we're kind of setting up straw men in a sense?
Sure. Look, I'd say a couple of things to that question. I mean, the one thing I want to be clear about is that we're not suggesting localization. I don't think we're suggesting localization always fails. I mean, there are situations in which localization can work. If you give a firm that is close to the frontier, that's pretty efficient, a guaranteed market with state purchase, and that firm is well run, ambitious, sees that the size of the domestic market is small and decides to invest those surplus profits in expanding its export capacity, that is possible. That is possible. And I think we have seen that in one or two situations. I think, but I stand open to correction, that Aspen may be such a firm. Having got procurement contracts from government, they used those, they invested, they became more export oriented. But the conditions under which that would happen are very limited. These are firms close to the technology frontier. They're ambitious firms, they're well run, and they use their resources, their extra profits, to promote their export capacity. Now, if the localization was such that it could identify such firms, and there was a requirement that if you got a government guaranteed contract or whatever, you would indeed invest in ensuring your export capacity, we might be getting somewhere towards a government-supported export strategy. So in Korea, for example, government provided very cheap finance to firms, but it provided that cheap finance to firms on condition that they exported. So in many newly industrializing countries, the requirement that you export is necessary for getting state support. In South Africa, there's no such localization. Is you get it, you do what you want with the profits. There's no identification of whether this firm is strong or weak or well-led or anything else. It's across the board. I don't think the DTI has that capacity to identify which firms might benefit from localization and expand their exports. So I think the problem is you've got a very blunt instrument, which is going to help a lot of inefficient firms. It may indeed occasionally help firms, as I've raised some examples, into the export market, but I think that's comparatively rare. And the capacity to identify that and to put requirements on those firms on the part of the DTIC, I think, is very limited, if non-existent. So I would say that about localization. I mean, this issue so there are nuances in this. There are nuances in this, and I think that's what we're being asked to address. And I think that you know what I don't think we are saying, but maybe we are. Maybe Laurence and Anne and I have some differences, and that's all to the good. But this infant industry story, there are infant industry protections, and there are times when those do work. I think others may think differently, but they always should be time bound. They should be limited in scope, and there should be sunset clauses. The problem with much of our infant industry protection that we've had, and I'd include autos in this, is that the protection has been very extensive, very long running, and in many, many cases, most cases, autos, for example, there are other examples, there's been no independent external evaluation of whether these subsidies that are provided, this support that's given, is actually the support that we want, that will generate the kind of export activity that will grow output and jobs on scale. And that's what I think is a concern, is that you look at our industrial policy, and Laurence has been very clear on this, and he's done some very pioneering work on this. Our export capacity has been declining constantly. Less firms coming into exporting, the existing exporters not increasing their products and new markets they're going into. We're doing very poorly on the export activity, and that's where the focus needs to be. The problem is that what we don't have is really any clear independent evaluation of those protectionist type policies that we have in place as to whether those are working, not working, whether those are adequate for the future going in. So I'd make that point, that the good industrial policy is not purely about open trade. That's not, I think, what we're arguing. Take away all forms of protection. I think some forms of protection that are time bound and have good initial justification has to be made, can be done, but they should have sunset, and they should be subject to independent evaluation after some period of time. And if found to be ineffective, government should have the capacity and the strength to withdraw those protections. That would be my position on that issue of whether we're being too simplistic by just saying, well, open everything up. I don't think that's what we're saying. Thanks.
Laurence, do you want to add to that, or can I move on?
Maybe just quickly. I think one is we are being somewhat simplistic, in part because it's a presentation to provoke comment and discussion, and the report is more nuanced in that relationship. And the issue is that localization covers many different issues, and so it's hard to term and define precisely what we mean by localization, because it covers the different issues. And so, from myself, I think I'm not against localization policies. I think we need policies that encourage the emergence of competitive local industries. That is a core component of building a local industrial base. And competitive implies that they're able to leverage off that base to export. But if you have policies, and particularly the choice of instruments that create inefficient local production base, it's difficult to leverage off that to become exporters. The transition from an inefficient firm working in a protected market to that of a global competitive exporter is very difficult to do. And I'd argue that part of our problem in the most recent years in terms of our export base is that we haven't developed a competitive local industrial base. And that, I think, is partly related to the many cross-cutting issues, the infrastructure issues, the electricity issues, the public, the prices of administered goods. And all of these factors really are undermining the development of a local, competitive industrial base that can leverage off to generate exports. And so I personally, my concern about the localization debate generally, which is also very broad and simplistic in its term, is it doesn't focus on that particular nuance of how do we create competitive industrial bases in order to export.
Thanks very much. Let me turn to a question from Temba. The presentation does not address predatory trade by major economies. It's clear in certain sectors that the imports being punted are actually dumping. We have seen that in steel, cement, and a lot in the poultry industry. We should be addressing dumping, which is rampant. Dave, I'm going to ask what your view is on that.
Well, and my view is that that Laurence is the expert. So I'll turn over to Laurence.
Laurence, good.
Okay. The WTO was created with lots of with leeway. It was prescriptive in terms of the tariff phase downs, but it created space for governments to pursue flexibility. And the one issue that created space was for unfair competition. So strong imports that were rapidly growing imports that would affect the domestic base, countries had the scope to provide safeguard duties. Dumping by foreign firms, the WTO permits the South African government authorities to impose anti-dumping duties because these are unfair and they undermine global trade. And so if dumping occurs, we have the absolute right within the WTO, and I think we have the obligation to impose anti-dumping duties against those products. But what the strength of the WTO agreement is that define the parameters around which we can impose those duties. We have to engage in proper assessment of whether anti-dumping is actually occurring. It is a phase-down process of the safeguard duties. So we bound ourselves to the rules within which we can impose these additional restrictions against unfair competition. And we need to actively make use of this. The problem, I think, in many cases, and let's take the poultry industry, where there is evidence of dumping, it seems, apparently, is the policy response has been to raise the duty of all imports, the MFN rate. So it's not targeting, there are some anti-dumping duties that are being imposed, but part of the response has been to impose general duties on all imports. And that, I think, is against the flavor of the problem. If the problem is dumping, I think we should impose duties to deal with the dumping. And we should try and avoid generalized duties that tax every consumer, irrespective from where they import the particular.
I see we have the CEO of PPC with us, Roland. Can I ask if we can unmute Roland and he can make the case for cement? Roland, if you're still with us. Yeah. Lydia, are we able to unmute Roland?
He's able to speak, he must just unmute himself.
Yeah. Roland, if you can unmute, that would be great. And then you can ask your question. And then Terence, I'll come to you. Not quite sure. Terence, why don't you ask your question from the media, and then we can try and help Roland to unmute.
Thanks, Anne. Terence Creamer, Engineering News. There's been a shift globally in light of COVID to shortening supply chains as the inefficiency of long supply chains was badly exposed during the lockdown periods. And we're currently also still in this stressed system that we see shortages all over the world. Are there any areas where having designated local capacity may be strategic and in fact efficient is the question. The second question is, in a context of what will be a multi-trillion rand electricity build out, which is now urgent to address load shedding, does it not make sense to seek to progressively localize some of the components that will be needed, such as pylons and the infant industries of wind and solar components, and eventually electrolyzers to produce hydrogen, not just for South Africa's program, but for export probably into the region and possibly beyond? Thank you.
Thanks, Terence. Dave, Laurence, who would like to come in first?
Dave would.
Dave, you need to unmute.
Okay. Well, let me take, so there are two questions there. Let me take the second one first. So again, on localization, I've raised times when localization may work at a firm level. This is, I think, looking at renewable energy, for example, this may be another area where localization could indeed work. So in this situation where government procurement is going to be extremely large and allows for the efficiency of scale to operate, and it has competitive bids by a range of bidders. So that's what's happened in the window. And South Africa has asked firms to bid on very large volumes, which allow for efficient scale, and has procured or will procure renewable energy at very, very low prices. That's and back of that, it is indeed possible that we may have sufficient demand for, I don't know, turbines or whatever the other components of renewable energy may be, which provide a chain going back into local production. Maybe the scale is indeed efficient and effective to allow that to happen. So this is an example, again, where localization may indeed operate effectively, in answer to your second question. But that's pretty rare. Well, that's a particular case. Most of those designated products, you look at a valve or a whatever, the scale demanded by government, the scale of government purchase is actually still does not allow those firms to have a minimum efficiency scale of production, doesn't allow them the basis on which to launch into exports, even should they so wish, and they won't so wish because they're making good profits on the local market. So I would say that about the second part of the question. I think about the first part of the question, the shortening of value chains. So I think my reading of it, and I'm probably no expert on this, but my reading of it is that the jury's still out. I mean, there are lots of short-term problems with value chains and restrictions, etc. And indeed, I think that countries are starting to make more things, industrialized countries, more of their products closer to home because value chains have shortened. And there have been disruptions in shipping and various things. And there are questions about whether the kind of disruptions that we're seeing are long-term or short-term. The Fed in the US takes the view that although we've had price rises as a result of that, this is going to be short-term and will be corrected. So I think I don't have a straightforward answer to that. I think things are in flux. And there may indeed be examples whereby local production being close to the market is a strong advantage. There may well be. But in which case, if that's so, if local producers are so empowered and can produce well, why give them any localization benefits? If they're going to be competitive because of shortening value chains, that's great. But there doesn't seem to me any reason then why you should add on to that some requirement that the good be purchased locally. It's a pretty off-cuff sort of response, but that's how I would address it. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. Laurence, do you want to add anything?
No.
Okay. I'll leave the cement issue. We're trying to track down Roland. We're not sure if he's here. Let's turn to Mike Morris, who's raised the question of the CDE advocating, or all of us advocating a kind of Washington consensus, no industrial policy approach to South Africa. I think from what you've heard, that isn't the case. And certainly all that I've learned from Dave Kaplan and all that CDE would think on this is that you do need a role for the state in the economy. So I don't think that's what we're advocating at all. But Dave or Laurence, would you like to come in on Mike Morris's big question? Laurence?
Yeah. So my view is that, the state is an essential player in the economy. It's a major contributor to key inputs in production. It coordinates massive investments across countries. It provides the legislation that enables firms to operate. It sets the legislation that regulates how workers are employed. These are all core kind of components of what governments do. And so these are active interventions in how firms operate. So just from that simple concept, the state is a critical player, and we need an efficient state, because the state is a critical place. And particularly in South Africa, we need a more efficient state because the key inputs that the states provide in society are overpriced, underprovided, and of poor quality, and in many of the administered services that are provided, for example. Does the state need to pursue beyond that? Absolutely. And we're in an environment of very high concentration of domestic industries. This gives firms enormous market power. And the state has to act on behalf of its citizens to ensure that these firms operate on behalf of everyone, not on behalf of the narrow constituents who are part of these firms. So, Mark, that's a further reason why we need key role of state. Thirdly, we do know that there are huge externalities associated with firms, and individual firms underinvest in, for example, education. They underinvest in setting up infrastructure or building capacity to produce because they don't capture the full gains. And the role of the state, there's huge externalities associated. This is classic market failure stuff. So the state in that front, again, has a very important role to facilitate and aid coordination. And I think the master plans are somewhat trying to achieve some of these, and it'll be interesting to see how this works out. But that's a key role you can see where the state is actively engaging with industry, both in terms of its provision of its own services, the coordination across the value chain in conjunction with firms and labor to try and resolve market failures or the inability of firms to grow. That's active state involvement, and I think we need that kind of coordination. What I'm concerned about on the localization, if that's under the premise of protection, and while protection can work, it should be used sparingly. It's a blunt instrument. It has huge costs on everyone. It's not a target. It doesn't target the core problem that leads to the inefficiency of the industry. So we need to be super cautious about how it's used. And when I read many of the master plans, is at the back there are elements of protection. When we look at the public procurement issue, that's a very highly protected policy to facilitate the emergence of local industries with, I think, a very inefficient policy instrument. effectively a quota, a minimum requirement. I would prefer to see a tariff, which regulates how much the price can increase on these products. So I'm absolutely, the state has a critical role, and we need to make it. And so I'm not absolutely, I think the Washington consensus is out, but that doesn't open the gate for everything and unregulated government interaction.
Thanks, Laurence. Dave, do you want to add anything?
I think Laurence was very eloquent. I'd agree with most of that. Look, I think that we may have some differences of view here as to whether, I mean, I think the difference may come down to whether at any stage governments have the capacity to identify certain sectors or that have very significant potential, but that potential would have to be very largely on the export side. And it is a difficult process, but I think it is also true that in the newly industrializing countries, particular firms, particular sectors were encouraged, but that encouragement, and this encouragement is difficult. It's dependent on what industrial structure you have and how well capacitated your government is. Also depends on the times at which you do it. So we're in different box from the newly industrialized countries. The fact that they did it doesn't mean that we should do it or we could be effective at doing it. But I don't preclude governments playing a role in identifying particular sectors that have particular possibility, particularly for export, and giving support to those sectors. However, that support must be to enhance efficiencies. That support must be transparent. That support must be evaluated, and government, it has a time limit, a sunset clause to it. And after external evaluation, if that's found to have worked, you may want to increase that or whatever. If it has been found not to work, you want to withdraw that. So I think that there is a role, but I think it's a circumscribed role, and it should certainly have time limits and external controls upon it. So I would leave it at that. I mean, these are complex issues, so yeah. I don't want to go too far down that road.
Thanks, Dave. I have Roland van Venen back. Roland, if you can raise your question about cement, that would be great.
Oh, thanks, Anne, and apologies that I stepped out a little bit earlier. Somebody came in. Thanks for a great debate. And I think at a very high level, generic, to stimulate local industries and not protect it because they get lazy, makes perfect sense. But as in many cases, I think if you're going too generic, you might leave out certain details. And if I look at the cement industry as a point in case, I come from a large global international company. I was responsible for global trading of clinker and cement. And what you see happening is that cement doesn't travel well. Cement is a local product. You would never build a cement plant for export, especially long distance export. Now, these exports are still happening because there is overcapacity in a local market. Vietnam is a point in case. So Vietnam has overcapacity. Their plants are nice, they're efficient. And for them, with their fixed costs being very high, they can do two things. They can produce more and try to fight for market share on the local Vietnamese market and reduce prices, which is normally what happens because cement is a bit of a commodity. Or they can say, we can put it on a vessel at variable cost, plus $1 or $2, use the back routes that a lot of vessels have that go full of product from Africa to Asia and come back empty, and dump it on the shores of a country where that particular global company doesn't have a footprint because they don't care about those markets. And unfortunately, South Africa at the moment does not have any global cement player active. So you are hurting local industry. And that is not a sustained model. If you go down that route, you will destroy local industry and you will become completely dependent on the availability of product from outside. You can look at countries like Kenya, who are currently struggling to get product in because the shipping rates have come up. And they have times without cement, then with cheap cement, then with expensive cement. And you've not created jobs. That's for me one part of the equation. Why I am urging for making a clear distinction between the general principles that you're advocating, which are not against to stimulate export industries, but the devil is in the details. And it's easily said, I know that I'm talking on behalf of my company. I understand that, so I am biased. And it is very tricky to give us protection and avoiding us to become lazy. I understand all of that. But I think it is one step too far just to make a generic statement that any form of localization is bad.
Great, thanks very much. David, Laurence, what's your, I think you've answered this question, but over to you. Dave?
Again, and I'll pass on this one. I mean,
Okay.
I'd like Laurent to answer, but I'm happy to come back after he's answered.
Okay, Laurence, over to you.
So I don't have a specific answer on this. I'm not the cement expert. So my understanding of the public procurement provision is that there's 100% quota requirement in terms of purchase of domestic cement. I may be incorrect on this front. So what's fascinating is that is the right instrument to deal with this competitiveness problem that's been raised. And I'd argue that it's not. If the domestic cement industry is facing an unfair competitive advantage for whatever reason, and it's well established and well researched and evaluated, well then I think you need a ad valorem protection measure, which provides a level of protection and that is capped by the percentage rate. But the instrument that has been proposed is a quota, which gives the domestic cement industries no upper bound in what price they can set when they sell cement to government-related institutes. And if the government is going to engage in a massive investment drive, which we hopefully will one day see, this can potentially raise the costs of the infrastructure drive. That ultimately becomes a transfer from the taxpayer to the 6 or so cement producers. And we need to ask ourselves, should we impose an upper bound on the extent to which we use the instrument that we've been proposed to deal with those competitive problems or that were raised? Is it the right instrument? And if so, then we need to ask that question. And I would answer no. I think it's very inefficient. And so broadly, anyway, so I think it's a complex issue, and I can't highlight that. But the complex issue is not resolved either by a blunt instrument. And namely, the blunt instrument that has been chosen of the quotas, 100% domestic content requirement, I think is a very inefficient instrument to use to deal with these problems.
Thanks very much. Okay.
And before you go on, just thanks,
Yes,
Laurence.
Roland.
I 100% agree with what you say there. The best instrument would indeed be almost the country by country, what are they doing, what are the numbers, and then you put either a tariff or anything else with a sunset clause to be regularly reviewed. It is a blunt instrument that I put in place. I'm not disagreeing.
Thank you. Well, somebody's asking if we could organize a debate or discussion with the department, with business, with labor and other stakeholders. We'd love to do that. I'm not sure everyone would come, but we'd love to do something like that. Martin says DTIC is on the call. Is there somebody senior from DTIC in the audience? We'd love to hear from you if you're here. If you put your hand up, I will give you time to respond.
I see Stephen Hannibal has sent in a comment from DTIC. Maybe we could ask Stephen if he would like to make a comment or a question.
Great. Stephen, are you with us? Would you like to come in? I'll give you a chance to talk if you'll put your hand up. Let me raise another question. Mohammed has asked a question. How can South Africa develop a local manufacturing base without localization mechanisms, such as LCRs, etc.? I'm not sure I know what an LCR is, but and that he's arguing that most jobs will come from manufacturing. So how do we get more jobs and grow our manufacturing base if we don't favor localization? I think we've answered a lot of that, and certainly from CDE's perspective, we would be saying you have to create a different environment in which manufacturing takes place. We need much more effective logistics infrastructure, and in my view, that means you have to have a radical approach to dealing with our failing and very expensive state-owned enterprises, because that's a key obstruction to the manufacturing sector. I think you have to look at carefully calibrated changes to the labor laws, and you have to get rid of a whole lot of regulations and red tape that the president keeps saying he's going to do, but we're not making much impact there, and a number of other things. I see Stephen is on the line. Can we unmute Stephen? Hi, Stephen.
Good morning. Good morning, Anne, and good morning to Professor Kaplan and Edwards. So thanks very much for allowing us to make a quick input. I mean, I think the one point we'd like to make is that when DTIC talks about the designation of particular products and sectors, we don't designate firms. So for example, in the case of cement, we know that there are 5 or 6 domestic cement manufacturers, and you've heard from one this morning. Similarly, we've designated clothing and textiles and furniture. There are multiple companies in those sectors that would compete with one another to win the tender. So I think we have to be a little more nuanced around the way that the designations are being implemented. It would be quite unusual for us to designate a product where there's only one domestic supplier. And one example might be, for example, steel pylons, where, of course, we've got only one major steel producer. Although, even in that case, there's one major producer, but a number of smaller steel manufacturers. So what we're not doing is designating where a company is then able to exploit its market power and push up prices dramatically. I mean, that's a cornerstone of what the Competition Commission would be monitoring and looking out for. The other thing that I would just want to say is that we also have to be a bit more nuanced, I think, on the export side. You know, the entire rationale for the African Continental FTA and the massive resources that South Africa has put into negotiating that is precisely because we think that we are a small developing country. We're far away from our major markets. And as we all know, Africa has been sliced up into tiny markets that are individually not going to be economically sufficient to support industrial development. So exports are a key part of our economic policy. The question would be, you know, how do we get into a market like the production of solar panels if, as part of the various renewable energy IPP rounds, we don't designate solar panels so that we begin to develop that capacity locally. Now, just to be clear, I mean, we did not designate solar panels at 100% because we accept that we don't have that industrial capacity in the country at the moment. We've actually designated at something in the order of 35%. And the thinking there is that as we build that local capability and the local production capacity, we would be able to increase that 35% to perhaps 50, 60, 70%. But certainly our blunt instrument, we are trying to use in as careful and nuanced a way as we can. And especially because we accept that, you know, we're not going to be able to miraculously produce semiconductor chips in a year's time. So we have to accept that we're going to import certain things. But our view, and it's supported by many parts of organized business, our view is that in many cases, because of our porous borders, because of the fact that our revenue service is not as effective as we would like, and because exporters outside of South Africa often exploit the lack of enforcement of our trade regulations, we do see a lot of imports coming in of products that actually we can produce very competitively locally. So, Anne, thanks very much for allowing the DTIC a quick input. But we really think that this is an important debate that we need to engage on much more going forward. And we would love to have other social partners make inputs as well, because of course we don't have the luxury of a 10% or 20% unemployment rate. We've got an unemployment crisis at 44%. And so taxpayer money, where government is spending money on building infrastructure, we really think that we should try to minimize the import leakages where we have domestic firms that are both competitive and have the capacity to produce in the quantities required. But thanks very much again for a very interesting discussion.
Thanks, Stephen. I'm going to hold my questions. Laurence, do you want to respond?
No, I think Stephen's added, a very good perspective from where the DTRC comes from. And I think the elements that some of us will agree, but also I think there are obviously clear dimensions that we would disagree. I've stated quite clearly, I think the designating quantities is a very bad instrument to achieve the outcomes. I would much prefer ad valorem, a percentage, a 20% preference or whatever it is that is decided on the basis of proper analytical work that provides the foundation of it. I would like it to be time bound. So there are some key issues behind some of these policies that I think we need to consider. I think this issue about the implications of localization and employment, this is obviously a key area for big debate. The presumption that is made that protection of localization is going to create jobs, I think we need to interrogate a little bit more carefully, because the evidence suggests in many cases that that's not the case. And I would argue that competitive firms that can able to export would be the fundamental basis through which we want to try and create jobs and good jobs. So I think there are many aspects within the points that Stephen's raised, and I think these highlight the complexity of this particular issue of localization, because it entails many different aspects and stuff. So Stephen suggested additional discussion and debate on these areas. I think that's this is a good platform from this presentation at least to work off, and I agree with him on this front. And I'll just close off. What I appreciate about this debate and this discussion of localization is a choice made by the state on behalf of the public, including business, including non-business, including consumers. And it can potentially have vast implications for all of us, and it needs contested. And so the more discussion and debate about this policy is important, because we need to hold the DTRC accountable for the policies that they implement, and they need to implement correct policies. So this process, I think, is critical as part of that process of engagement.
Thanks, Laurence. On behalf of CDE, Stefan, we would be very keen to organize a further discussion with the minister, with senior officials, with organized business, with labor on this. So please see this as an invitation, and we'd really like to follow this up with you and try and organize something on the report we've done and bringing in other people to widen the discussion, as Laurence has just said. I'm starting to run out of time. Dave, do you want to come in on this issue? Or
just very briefly, really to thank Stephen for joining in the debate, and to echo what you said and what Laurence has said. And if we could have a dialogue with the DTIC, that would be great in any form. And thank you, Stephen, for adding some important points to the localization issue. Just one thing that I would say is that we do recognize that it's not in general, and I think probably never, that a specific firm is given a monopoly on a particular procurement. There is some competition, but we all recognize, I think Stephen would agree, that competition in the domestic market is very limited. There are, in many instances, and in many of those instances of designated products, there are very few producers. Imports represent a very large part of the competitive pressure and the competitive process. Taking imports out altogether is a big move. It substantially reduces competition. putting a tariff, if you like, or a limit 35 or 40% helps, but it is an anti-competitive measure in that sense. It is anti-competitive. It's not that there's no competition. I don't think we were saying that, but it is an anti-competitive measure. And I'd like to say a bit more about that, because, you know, once you receive as a firm a procurement from government, and you are in a situation where you're making good profits out of your business with government as a result of the localization policy, you're going to work very hard to keep that profitable market. You're going to work, and you may indeed resort to anti-competitive behavior to prevent newcomers coming in and taking part of that market. There are all sorts of things that will happen that incumbent firms, so it's anti-competitive in two ways, because there's no imports, which are a big part of the competition process, and anti-competitive because it makes it much more difficult. The barriers to entry for new firms coming into the market for these products is substantially raised. So I think, and we know that our minister in this instance is very concerned with competition. And I think that it's hard to square localization with enhanced localization is both anti-export, as we've stressed in this talk, but I'd like to also say we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that it is also anti-competitive. But let's have that discussion with Stephen and with the DTIC would be fantastic to do that. Thanks.
Dave, can I just follow up with a question? So Stephen had asked, why can't the 5 or 6 domestic cement manufacturers, for example, compete with each other inside South Africa to become more competitive? Can you sort of deal with that a bit?
Well, they can. I mean, they can and they do. They can and they do. But, you know, they all face somewhat similar, they're all in this local environment, right? So they face the same wages, they face the same transport issues, etc. They're working off the same kind of base. Importing firms are coming in with different technologies, different base. They may be innovating in all sorts of ways. They're bringing, it's the imports that bring in substantive competition and bring in new products, and so yes, they are competing, but because they're at similar base, the competition is, if you like, limited. It is limited. It's not that, as I said, it's not that it's not there. It's certainly there. And in the South African context, where the market is small and where there are few producers, 6 in the case of cement, some of those other products designated have much less than 6. Competition will be very limited, and it'll be limited precisely from imports, which are not just important in themselves, but often bring newness. And it's imports that bring improved cement or improved pump or valve or something. That's where the imports are so critical, is that they bring in novelty and they force local firms to adjust and adapt. And the minute you say, we make this valve or this pump in South Africa, we don't want the import, what you're saying is all that technology change and new innovation that's happening in imports and pumps that importers are bringing in, we're cutting ourselves out of that. So you're substantially reducing your technological kind of borrowing, if you like, and the kind of competition that firms are into, let's say, in pumps and valves domestically, will be substantially reduced, not just because there are fewer players, the importers are not there, but because they are now not competing with the latest and the most innovative that are being brought in by importers. So imports, local competition is no substitute, in my view, to competition from imports. I don't know, Laurence may have something to say on that, but that's how I would look at it. So I accept what Stephen says. They are interested in competition. They don't designate for single firms, but I still think it's important to recognize that competition through this localization has been significantly reduced or inhibited.
Laurence, any additional comments before I close?
Yeah, no, just to reinforce, I mean, when we look at the firm data, we look at productivity, we look at output, we look at export performance, all these key attributes, high value added firms, bigger exports, These performance outcomes are very closely associated with the capacity of the firm to import foreign technology, import key intermediate goods, because the evidence then when we look at the firm data clearly suggests that access to ranges of imported inputs complement the range of domestic inputs. So firms want wide range of domestic inputs that are competitively priced, but they also want wide range of foreign imports that are competitively priced. And these contribute to the very goals that the governments are trying to achieve. Bigger firms, high value added firms that employ more workers that are able to export. And so again, just to close off, these are important attributes associated with imports, and we don't want to lose sight of that in the localization debate. And so, and at times this is lost. We do lose sight of this in this debate. And we can then implement policies that constrain access to some of these key intermediate goods in some cases. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Let me zoom out for a bit to the bigger picture. So localization was one of the key pillars of President Ramaphosa's recovery strategy announced in October last year. And if you look at it, it seems to us to be not only an anti-competitive approach, a blunt instrument in general, but the wrong priority for South Africa now. We should be trying to make our economy as competitive as possible, our logistics as efficient and at global standards as quickly as possible. And in many ways, it's kind of accepting the failures of South Africa to create a much better environment where the state has a very important role, but has failed. We have failed to produce the infrastructure, the logistics, the educated, skilled workforce that the country needs, and deal with crime and all sorts of other things that affect how businesses can survive and compete. And I think that's the bigger picture in which the CDE report is saying not only is this the wrong priority for the country, but it will have enormous negative consequences however it's implemented. We're also in a situation where the state, for a whole lot of reasons, from state capture to cadre deployment, is weak. And to have all these powers situated in one department seems to us to be the wrong approach as well. So it's a question of prioritization, of how we make this an economy that opens up entrepreneurial opportunities for non-designated firms and for new incumbents. Not only all the innovation and that Dave is talking about from imports, but also for new Black firms to get into the market and to become competitive and export-oriented as quickly as possible. We have to grow our economy by 5% per annum if we're going to deal with our unemployment crisis. So again, the question is this the best route to making South Africa's economy as effective as possible? And that's certainly not the view of our analysis or a number of the sort of academics and others that we've spoken to. So I recommend everyone reads the report. It's more nuanced and detailed than my presentation. And thanks for joining us today. And a very big thank you to Professor Laurence Edwards and Professor Dave Kaplan for assisting CD in producing our own report and then in participating in today's event. And hopefully we can have a follow-up with the DTIC and organized business and labor at another occasion. Thanks very much, everybody. This event is now closed. Thanks for joining us. Thank you.